the unburied past, how ancient Babylon, Judah, and Persia and Europe still fight through Israel, Iran, and America. Prologue: Three Carriers of Time. Three people stand at the center of today's conflict between Israel, Iran, and the United States. Each carries a different weight of history. The Jew carries 3,000 years of covenant, catastrophe, and return, time folded into liturgy and memory. The Persian carries 25 centuries of empire, justice, and resistance, a civilization that taught the world how to rule and how to endure. The American carries a shorter memory, but one shaped by Europe's long wars of religion, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Holocaust, a civilization that reinvented itself as a willed future, yet cannot escape the past it fled. None of these three is merely modern. All are vessels of antiquity, and the war between them, whether fought with sanctions, airstrikes, cyber attacks, or Friday sermons, is not a new war. It is the latest iteration of a drama that began in Sumer, took shape under Babylon and Persia, and has never concluded. 1. The ancient stage before Israel. Before there was a people called Israel, the Middle East had already invented civilization. In the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians, circa 4,500 to 1900 BCE, built the first cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu. They created cuneiform writing, not for poetry but for accounting, then law, then lament. The lament for Ur, circa 2000 BCE, became the first recorded mourning for a destroyed city, a genre the Jews would perfect after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The Sumerians conceived the foundational structure that would never die, the settled, ordered city versus the wild, chaotic periphery. Enlil, the god of order, stood against Tiamat, the dragon of saltwater chaos. Every subsequent empire, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, inherited this grammar. Sargon of Akkad, circa 2334 BCE, invented universal empire, one king over the 4 quarters of the world. Hammurabi of Babylon, circa 1754 BCE, inscribed law on stone for all to see. Justice performed publicly, even if most could not read. The Assyrians perfected terror as policy, mass deportation, impalement, the breaking of people through spectacle. Then came the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II, 605 to 562 BCE. In 586 BCE, they destroyed Jerusalem's first temple, blinded the king of Judah, and marched the Jewish elite into captivity. That wound, exile, loss, the question of why God abandoned his people, became the template for Jewish historical consciousness. But even as Babylon inflicted the wound, a different power was rising in the east. 2. The emergence of Israel on the stage of history. The first unambiguous mention of Israel outside the Bible is the Merneptah Stele, circa 1208 BCE, an Egyptian inscription that boasts, "Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more." That irony, announcing the destruction of a people who still exist 3,200 years later, is the core of Jewish identity. The early Israelites emerged not as a conquering empire, but as a highland people in the land of Canaan, between the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Their innovation was radical, a covenant with a single invisible God who demanded not monuments or armies, but law, justice, and memory. Unlike the gods of Sumer and Babylon, who were tied to cities and kings, Yahweh could be worshipped anywhere, which meant the Jews could survive anywhere. Their literature, the Hebrew Bible, is not a chronicle of power. It is a record of failure, repentance, and stubborn hope. The prophets condemned their own kings. The psalmists wept by the rivers of Babylon. The Book of Lamentations mourned a destroyed city with a rawness no empire ever wrote about itself. When the Persians arrived, the Jews encountered something unprecedented. 3. Jews and Persians, the ancient alliance. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. His policy was the opposite of Assyrian terror and Babylonian deportation. The Cyrus cylinder, unearthed in 1879, records his edict. He returned deported peoples to their homelands, restored local cults, and allowed temples to be rebuilt. For the Jews, this was salvation. Cyrus permitted them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The prophet Isaiah 45, calls Cyrus Messiah, Anointed One, the only non-Jew ever given that title. The Persian king is described as God's instrument of justice. The Achaemenid Empire, 550 to 330 BCE, ruled through incorporation, not eradication. Its satrapies preserved local laws and religions. The Jews lived peacefully under Persian protection for 2 centuries. The Persian court at Susa and Persepolis welcomed Jewish officials such as Nehemiah and Esther. That was not tolerance as exception. It was Persian governance as a system. That memory, the Persian as liberator, not enemy, has never fully died in Jewish consciousness. It is one reason modern Iran's hostility toward Israel carries an ancient irony. President Harry S. Truman famously declared, "I am Cyrus," drawing a parallel between himself and the ancient Persian king who allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. The heirs of Cyrus are now in conflict with the Jewish state, a fracture of memory that neither side fully acknowledges. 4. 70 CE, exile, and the portable homeland. In 70 CE, the Romans under Titus destroyed the Second Temple. The catastrophe was final. No third temple would be built. The Jews were scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 CE, ended with Hadrian renaming the province Syria Palestina, a deliberate erasure of Judea. But the Jews had already learned the lesson of Babylon. They carried their homeland in texts, the Hebrew Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud. The rabbis of Yavna reorganized Jewish life around study and prayer. The synagogue replaced the temple. The scholar replaced the priest. For 1,800 years, from 135 CE to 1948, the Jews lived as a people, without sovereignty, scattered from Spain to Poland to Yemen to Persia, where they continued to live, often protected under Iranian Muslim rule as a dignified minority. They survived through what the historian Yerushalmi called Jewish memory, the past not as history but as liturgy. Every Passover, each Jew must see themselves as having personally left Egypt. Every Tisha B'Av, they mourn the destruction of both temples, the expulsion from Spain, the Khmelnytsky pogroms, the Holocaust, all on one day. This is the weight the modern Israeli carries. When an Israeli general plans a preemptive strike, he is not seeing only the immediate threat. He sees Nebuchadnezzar, he sees Titus, he sees Hitler. Never again is not a political slogan. It is a theological commitment. 5. The European layer. How the West became entangled. The third carrier is the heir of Europe, today embodied most powerfully in the United States. Europe's own history is a palimpsest of Rome, Germanic tribes, Christendom, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. The Roman Empire, which destroyed Jerusalem, later became Christian. The Germanic peoples, Franks, Goths, Saxons, whom Rome called barbarians, became the carriers of European civilization. The English are a Celtic Roman Anglo-Saxon Norman hybrid. The Germans, decentralized for centuries, eventually unified under Prussia in 1871, and then in the 20th century produced the Holocaust. That genocide created modern Israel. The survivors of the camps, many from German-speaking lands poured into Palestine. The United Nations voted for partition in 1947. Israel declared independence in 1948. The European heir, America, became Israel's indispensable ally for multiple reasons, including shared religious identity and the idea of a Judeo-Christian Western civilization. Thus, the three carriers are now arranged. Israel, the returned indigene carrying 3 millennia of memory, including the Persian liberation and the Roman destruction. Iran, the heir of Cyrus and the Sasanians, carrying a memory of empire, justice, and resistance to foreign domination, whether Roman, Arab, Mongol, or Western. America, the heir of mostly Germanic Europe, carrying the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Crusades, mostly forgotten, and the Holocaust, partly remembered. Now the guarantor of a global order that Iran sees as a new empire and Israel sees as its only shield. 6. The descendants. Today, transformed yet retaining the link in Tehran, the Islamic Republic is not the Achaemenid Empire in modern garb. Iran is a Muslim country, yet ancient Persian identity remains. Street names, public memory, the name Iran itself, all recall an imperial past. When Iran supports Hezbollah as resistance against Israel, it invokes a Sasanian concept, Paydad, just resistance, against foreign invaders, first developed against Rome. Iran sees itself as the heir of a civilization that once protected Jews, and now sees the Jewish state as a Western colonial implant, a new Crusader kingdom. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Israelis live in a modern democracy with advanced technology and a powerful military. But on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, sirens stop traffic and the entire nation stands in silence. On Tisha B'Av, they read, "Lamentations by the Western Wall." The Iranian nuclear program is not merely a strategic threat, it is a potential second Holocaust. When an Israeli Prime Minister warns that Iran must not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, he speaks not only in geopolitical terms, but as the heir of survivors. In Washington, American policymakers analyze interests, alliances, and deterrence. They rarely speak of Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar, but the deep structure of American foreign policy, the belief that the United States is an exceptional nation with a mission to spread liberty, descends from European Christendom filtered through the Enlightenment. The city on a hill is a biblical phrase. The rules-based order is Rome's Pax Romana updated. Americans do not see themselves as crusaders, but much of the Muslim world does, because the crusader layer, the forgotten in the West, is remembered in the East. 7. The resurrection of Baal. Here is the strangest return. In certain strands of Iranian clerical rhetoric, modern Israel is not merely a political enemy. It is identified with Baal, the ancient Canaanite and Phoenician deity who appears in the Hebrew Bible as the arch-rival of Yahweh. Baal was the god of storms, fertility, and, in prophetic polemic, child sacrifice. The valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, was associated with Molech or Baal worship, where children were allegedly passed through fire. The Hebrew prophets condemned this in the strongest terms. Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Hosea denounced Israel's own Baal worship as spiritual adultery. Now, in some Iranian state media, the Star of David has been recast as the seal of Baal. Israel is described not as a Jewish state, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but as a reincarnation of idolatrous tyranny, Tagut in Quranic language. This is not geopolitical analysis. It is theological condemnation. The Persians, who in the 6th century BCE presented themselves as liberators of the Jews from Babylonian paganism, now invoke a pagan Canaanite god to condemn the Jewish state. The ghost of Baal, dust for 2,000 years, his temples crumbled, his cults extinct, has been raised again, not because anyone worships him, but because the structure of sacred enmity requires a name for absolute evil. For the Hebrew prophets, Baal was the rival. For some Iranian clergy, Israel becomes that rival. The wheel turns. 8. 3 carriers, 1 stage. What does this mean for the war today? The nuclear negotiations, the shadow war, the protests in Tehran, the airstrikes in Syria. It means that each side interprets the present through a different past. The Iranian sees American bases in the Middle East and remembers Roman legions and British gunboats. The Israeli sees a nuclear-armed Iran and remembers the gas chambers. The American sees a chaotic region and remembers 9/11, but has little memory of 1953, the CIA coup in Iran, or even the 1979 hostage crisis as a lived trauma. Thus, each side appears irrational to the others, but each is rational within its own historical horizon. The Persian says, "We were the first universal empire. We protected Jews when no one else did. We are not Arabs. We are not the enemy of civilization. We resist foreign domination." The Jew says, "We were exiled, massacred, and nearly annihilated in living memory. We will never trust our survival to any power again." The American says, "We are the guarantor of a liberal order. We seek stability, democracy, and non-proliferation." Why do they hate us? The answer is layered. The hatred is not personal. It is structural. The 3 carriers are acting out scripts written long before any of them were born. Conclusion: reading the script, then writing anew. The Israeli, the Iranian, and the American each carry conflicting narratives. The Iranians assert their right to be free of foreign intervention, to develop peaceful nuclear energy, and to remember a glorious past. The Israelis are haunted by the need for safety and the right to exist, to protect their citizens from annihilation. The Americans, for their part, find themselves with a questionable right to side with Israel in this war, when no direct US interest is jeopardized. The war among Israel, Iran, and America is not a new war. It is the latest chapter of conflicts whose origins lie in the ancient Middle East. The stones of Persepolis, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the Roman arches in Libya, the ruined high places of Baal on Mount Carmel. These are not ruins, they are active participants. The dead do not merely influence the living, they command them through the imaginations of the living. But if the dead rule the living are not powerless. They can learn to read the scripts they have been given. Recognition does not resolve conflict, but it is the precondition for any resolution that is not merely the triumph of one over the other. The dead still rule the living. They always have, they always will, until we learn to read the scripts they left us, and then, perhaps, to write new ones. Not by forgetting the past, but by carrying it differently, as memory without possession, as grief without vengeance, as identity without the erasure of the other.